Hello, today I am with Jeff Stafford, who is a Senior Learning and Development Specialist. I have asked Jeff to join me today to speak about creativity in organizations. Jeff is the Program Manager for Leadership Development at Be the Match, the National Marrow Donor Programs that facilitates non-related cellular therapy for those suffering from blood-based disease. His work focuses on developing and delivering professional development experiences for the 1,200 leaders and individual contributors in the organization. Prior to joining Be the Match, Jeff had more than 15 years experience working with organizations, teams, and individuals in the area of leadership development. And for the last 8 years, he taught in the leadership minor at the University of Minnesota. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
You're welcome.
So let's start off with a definition. How would you describe creative leadership?
I think when I think of the term creative leadership, to me, it's more of a philosophy or an approach on how one leads and how one builds engaged teams. Creative leadership allows teams to be and do their best through innovation practices that produce and drive results, however that's measured in someone's respective team or organization. And then I also believe creative leadership is that approach that embraces and navigates the ambiguity of change, whether it's big or small, and the circumstances of the world today. I mean, I don't think change should be viewed as an event or a specific implementation, but more of a common occurrence in everyday practice. And then lastly, building off of that, the idea that change is common every day, I think creative leadership is a tool to create that nimbleness or that quickness in organizations or teams that embraces testing ideas, showing your work through prototypes or versions 1, 2, 3.0, whatever that might be. That's my take on it.
And I really appreciate that you're making that connection between organizational change and creativity, because they are closely intertwined. And if they're not closely intertwined in an organization, they really should be. And so can you speak a little bit more about why creativity is important in organizations?
Yeah, I think organizations are being asked, probably demanded to be even more nimble and agile at a much quicker pace than probably ever before. And I think even if you take, the COVID pandemic and how many organizations had to transition to a full-time work from home situation, the speed in which to do that, there were no strategies, there were no playbooks on how to do that. And they had to kind of figure out, okay, everyone work at home, we still have to be productive, we still have to continue the work as needed, but that was all done on the fly, especially since there was no blueprint for any way to kind of navigate that ambiguity. And I think one other piece that I would add is I think, that whole trial and error was kind of the approach for that, which I think is also an approach within creative organizations, because they believe that that failure piece, that trial part, is part of the creative process that enables folks to learn from those experiences as well as get better results. And I think also organizations, need people who can thrive while being engaged with the work that they do. And part of the research that I look at, offers up that people want to be developed, people want to grow, people want to have a sense of autonomy and mastery in their work. And when they do, they're much better employees. And I would just kind of say that is the essence of why creativity, or what creativity in organizations could look like.
Yeah, so a little bit of a follow-up to that, because I think it's really important that you talked about that whole idea of trial and error and learning from failure. So can you speak a little bit to how leaders might be able to embrace that? Because some leaders don't want to fail, okay? They feel that it's too high of a stakes, but as you point out, that's part of the creative process. So what can leaders do to be a little bit more comfortable with failure and to show that it's not necessarily a bad thing?
I think they have to demonstrate that. And demonstrate that means to be vulnerable, to create the kinds of trust in your organization that allows for mistakes. And I think it's also, how is a mistake dealt with? Is it something that's swept under the rug and I don't want you to know if you're my leader? Or is it something that, because I know that it might be retributive, or punitive in nature? Or is it something that you and I have developed enough of a relationship where I can bring those things to you because as a leader, I hope to believe that you've got my best interest intact. I have your best interest as well as the organization's best interest intact, and that we can learn from it. And to me, like, failure's fine the first time around, but if failure is something that like I keep repeating, then there's something, from a performance management standpoint, we have to talk about course correcting and things like that. But I think it really comes with how do we view mistakes, failure, and can we see that from a growth mindset, a learning perspective that allows us to do better in whatever next iteration it could look like.
I agree. And I think that your point about vulnerability is really important. I know that a lot of leaders are uncomfortable about thinking about being vulnerable, but I think your point about demonstrating and role modeling that you have to do that to learn from your errors and to grow professionally. And as you know, leaders are lifelong learners. And so by having that mindset will help demonstrate the behaviors that you want to see in a creative organization. So what are some things that leaders can do to encourage creativity in organizations? You have some specific strategies or tips
Right.
that a leader can say, okay, if I do these things, maybe the organization will embrace the idea of creativity a little bit more.
I think if I were to just give like one solid idea of where you start, beyond all of like the processes, tools, techniques that are out there that you'll probably be talking about, but from a leadership standpoint, if you can focus on building teams that can take risks with each other. To me, and I know this is easier said than done. I absolutely know that is easier said than done. But I think there's 3 specific strategies I know I've shared with leaders in the past, and it's the first one is take time to get to know each other. Create a team development plan that includes ways in which you can learn about each other and how you best work or approach work and your life. I've used the Myers-Briggs type indicator or something like that just gives us some common language to connect about how we communicate, how we make decisions, how we deal with conflict. The second strategy, I would say, get better at asking questions versus telling people what to do. Again, I think this kind of cultivates that trust and that transparency, where if you can take on maybe that like coach approach to your work and ask people, what do they think? Because oftentimes I think when individual contributors maybe come to leaders, they have an inkling or a sense of like what they might want to do, but I think they're just seeking permission to be able to do that. And so the role of leader is to be able to pull that out from them, and that's by asking questions versus being directive and telling them what to do. The last strategy, I think, goes back to this vulnerability piece, goes back to transparency, ultimately influences creativity in organizations, is as a leader, ask your team for feedback about your performance, about what you're doing. And I think the reason to do that is that when you can ask for feedback and be open to receiving it. So it's not about defending, debating, rationalizing, just being open to taking that in. I think it creates that kind of environment or culture where when you need to deliver feedback to someone, they might be better to receive it because you also are open and willing to be able to get other perspectives, other opinions. I think creating a culture where you can be candid, transparent, and respectful creates really high levels of engagement. And that's the kind of culture engagement where creativity can actually flourish.
And I think that's really great advice because, and again, it's such a simple thing to do is to, to listen, to ask questions and to really hear other people. Again, it's going to draw out all those ideas that we're going to have from our coworkers, maybe from our employees and others that we work with. And I think that that's a great thing to think about in terms of creating a creative organization, because it's so simple. It really is a simple thing to do.
Simple, not easy, right?
No, it isn't.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is really simple advice. But again, it's a shift in mindset, like you said from the beginning, of less of directing and more on facilitating and listening, and opening up yourself to other ideas. Do you have any other last minute tips or suggestions for leaders who are wanting to create a creative organization?
I think don't take on the burden that you have to get it right. Like I think there's a point in time where I worked with a business coach for a while, building my own business, and what they said to me was, "Build the plane as you fly it." And I thought, "What do you mean?" And as engineers, don't want to do that. However, as leaders in organizations dealing with people, the idea of building the plane while you fly it is taking in data and information and making the best informed decision at the point, not having to be stuck to go, is this the right decision? Because that ability to be able to course correct once you get new information, I think is also important in building that nimble and swift organization that can adapt to the changing times of today or whatever the future might bring for us.
That's some great advice. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and some of your insights on creativity. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.